Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon. My name is Hilton Supra, and I'm moderator for Fourth Industrial Revolution, how cities and businesses can transform their infrastructure and supply chain with Society 5.0, AI and blockchain, and sustainability frameworks. Thank you very much to our esteemed panelists for joining us today. We have an hour to go through some of the issues revolved around and centered on cities and businesses and their transformative journey, in particular looking at infrastructure and supply chain. I've got Kieran Fernandez, Professor and Associate Dean of Durham University, with us today. He's the Internationalization and Professor of Operations Management at the Durham University Business School. He's also an Executive Director of the Northern Powerhouse Innovation Observatory and a Fellow of the University of Durham and the Wilson Research Institute. He's held academic positions at the Universities Warwick and York and is a Professor Invité in Lyon, in France, and a special advisor and consulting professor at the Cabinet Office Civil and Contingency Secretariat. He has been appointed by the UK Secretary of State for International Development and a non-executive director of the UK National Commission for UNESCO, with special responsibility for higher education. And in 2017 was elected vice chair of the UK NC. He's also director of Global Gateway Federation, and he currently sits on a range of advisory panels covering various aspects of operations and innovations management, academic advisory council members and chartered management institute, and is a member of a variety of editorial boards. Welcome, Professor Fernandez. We've got Michael Stanley Jones. He's sitting in Nairobi, having left -2 degrees in Bohemia, very close to where one of our other panelists are. And he is the Program Management Office for United Nations Environment Program. As a Program Management Officer for the United Nations, he supports knowledge management and digital transformation within the ecosystem integration branch based in Nairobi, and a co-secretariat of United Nations Alliance for Sustainable Fashion from 2018 in July until September this year. Michael is an advocate for engagement with the textile and apparel industry, and based on the 2030 agenda, I think it is, for sustainable development. And if you probably know Michael, he's also a very, very interesting poet. We've got Rona. Rona is a founder and director of Coco Airline Consulting Limited, which is a consulting business that puts brands at the heart and creates effective return on investment. They've worked with some of the biggest brands, working with likes of Red Bull, Heineken, Rugby World Cup, to the UK's best known names like Green King, NEC Group, and Carling, to name a few. She's managed significant capital and milestones that are still in the market today, and most importantly, guided senior leaders through change by addressing the challenge head on, by creating effective new strategies and corporate goals. She's negotiated at incredible levels for asset purchases and large deals, and in very positive impact everywhere that she goes in terms of her business acumen. And working very much and focusing on work across all areas, particularly FMG, MCG, retail, and sports sectors. Then we've got Monika Kochiova, who's the director of the Slovak Chamber of Commerce and Industry and the Kozice regional chamber. She's responsible for the operations of the chamber, which is basically for the second largest region of Slovakia, managing a large team and cooperating with a significant number of foreign diplomatic countries. I think it's about 30 plus in the European region, and 20 chambers of commerce industry-wide. She's been basically managing and working with lots of NGOs in various countries in Europe, and also focusing on cross-functional projects with multiple domestic partners. And in terms of attending and organizing conferences and forums and working with all the delegations and professional training and seminars that she was actually involved in. Thank you very much for joining us. I'd like to start by saying that advanced leading-edge solutions like augmented reality, the cloud, and big data, which are technologies pertaining to Industry 4.0 and Society 5.0, for Society 5.0. Now, these technologies improve work conditions, they create new business models and increase both productivity and company quality production. However, they can also improve life and society as a whole. The new perspective oriented towards social and global well-being is called Society 5.0, where we put the citizen in the center of all this industry 4.0 development. So my first question to the panel is, how can cities and governments create a policy to enable the adoption of 4IR technologies in terms of Society 5.0 and frame it in terms of infrastructure and supply chain? So Kiran, can you just, because we talked about this a lot, can you talk a little bit of how governments can create policy to enable this adoption?
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to be on the panel, Hilton. I think you asked a very interesting question, and the question is, how do you bring about interaction between a number of stakeholders, and in this case, particularly policymakers? To answer that, perhaps what we might want to talk about briefly before answering is, what is Society 5.2? Because at the heart of this particular society is a mechanism that will allow policymakers to engage and create this Society 5.2. Now, there are various definitions, and this whole event has covered a lot. So broadly putting it in sort of few words, some of them call it a super smart society. Super smart society is an ecosystem. It's an ecosystem of a number of things that come together. And the way I like to look at it is a place that connects to technology, which connects to business, and then it connects to knowledge, which again connects to place. So it's like a circular system. And at the heart of this is one enabler, and that's policy making. So to answer your question, how can policymakers, or how can policy affect? I think policy can affect how a place is organized. And this is where issues of not just economics, but issues around how you organize a space in terms of technology, connectivity, sustainability, education, etc., all come together. And then what also policymakers can do is connect to how technology can play a role in this place, how businesses can then feed from this technology, and how policies can affect effective knowledge transfer in this space. So I think in a number of ways, policymakers can engage in several dimensions. And there are several examples where you can see very pragmatic policymaking on how you can create this space. For example, if you look at the northeast of England, the region where I'm currently located, you can see how policymaking is bringing together knowledge along with the industry, as well as the business ecosystem and technology together, the triple helix, to make a system that works. And it's based around an open innovation policy. And this whole idea of an open innovation policy is you allow these stakeholders to engage with one another and create an ecosystem from which policies emerge. Because having a generalized policy will never work. Policy has to be targeted. Policy has to make a place which is at the heart of Society 5.0, a particular situation where this ecosystem can be enabled. So I think the future of policymaking is going to be far more open. It's going to be at the heart of it is how these stakeholders can come together to create policies along with policymakers. So that's my view on how policy can engage with place in a 5.2 system.
Thank you. Monica, you do deal with lots of the chambers of commerce and, of course, very much integration with governments. but how? What is your experience of policymaking and in this particular context?
Well, what we have been seeing recently, it's more interest of the governments, either local or national, in the qualified data collection and also in the more participative models of engagement with the society and with the citizens. So I think what's the future, apart from the cooperation and the effective ecosystems that Professor Fernandez has been mentioning, which is the cooperation of academia, research and development, businesses, and also the governments. It's also a very innovative systems that would collect the data, and also the willingness of the governments to base their decisions and policymaking on qualified research. And so I think that we are in a good way in our space in the Central Europe, for example, and also in the city and the region where we are currently. I think that it's very important that we focus on a certain path, not that we do not generalize everything, that we suggest the priorities where we want to cooperate and we want to go forward. And first of all, that we include the citizens in the decision making.
Thank you for that. Michael, you've been working very much at the United Nations level in terms of developing policy and dealing with many governments in terms of putting that policy in place. What's your experience in that area?
You know, it actually builds directly on my experience in Košice, Slovakia, which was my last event that I helped United Nations Development Program and United Nations Environment Program co-organize with the Danube Environmental Forum, which was a 10-country coalition of green groups, of grassroots organizations, of environmental advocacy organizations who came together to support implementation of a newly adopted convention, the Danube Environmental Protection Convention, the Danube River Basin Convention, which Slovakia is a member of. And Košice, the city, hosted with the university and local NGOs a forum of 10-country green groups. And we helped craft policy statements that governments could consider when they convened the first meeting of the parties to the Danube Convention shortly after this adoption. I then returned to my home in Silicon Valley, California, and joined a new coalition called the Silicon Valley Environmental Partnership. And here, I think we really followed the model of bringing the civil society together with local government, leadership from municipalities, from cities, county leadership, regional leadership, and state leadership, along with the business community. So it was a partnership of business, government, and civil society that helped craft the agenda. Eventually, the partnership morphed. It evolved to become a new organization called Sustainable Silicon Valley, which helped advocate for smart growth in the cities, for energy reform, and for clean water, among other issues. It was one of the first groups to work with the governor's office, the then Governor Schwarzenegger, on the climate agenda to cut the carbon footprint of California society. So these are examples of how we brought together really Silicon Valley's IT leadership and applied emerging technologies like GIS, like internet clearinghouse platforms. Still early days, we didn't have mobile telephony in those days, but we were talking about community monitoring of the environment, where information gathered by the grassroots, by the public, could inform decision-making by regional and state and eventually international authorities. Because I then went back from my grassroots neighborhood, where I worked on issues of toxic pollution and of energy conservation, transport, and clean water, to join the United Nations Environment Program eventually a decade later. So it's really this transiting of activism between the real actors in our communities, which are businesses, local leadership, and civil society citizens, with the governmental processes and structures like the intergovernmental organizations I work for now, and the legal instruments, the Danube Convention, the Aarhus Convention on Access to Information, Public Participation, and Access to Justice in Environmental Matters, to which Slovakia is also a member state, and larger instruments like the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. I'll stop there, but I think that there needs to be this fluidity between society and governance that works at all levels.
Thank you, Michael. And Rona, with your work that you did with ARC 2030, and particularly your engagement with the Princess Trust, in terms of your engagement with policymaking, can you explain a little bit more about ARC 2030 in that context?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, in terms of bringing it around infrastructure and supply chain and policy always scares people. So I think it needs to be education, build confidence and give clarity. We all know that when we put the people at the heart of something and we equip them with those tools, that they will absolutely thrive. And to Michael's point, there's a strong piece here around education. So, for example, I became a founding member of ARC 2030, which is part of the UN Decade of Change, in the summer, mainly because of their audacious goals, but because of the action that they're taking. But as part of that, we are going to be educating free of charge over 1 billion students globally around kind of that crisis. Now, what's important about that is anyone listening who may have children or nieces and nephews, I learn an awful lot when it comes to digital and tech from my kids, albeit they're 11 and 7. But what I found is that by engaging youth minds, it's really powerful in terms of looking at the diversity in decision-making roles, but also a consideration for having like a youth board, a silent exec team, where you've got people from all walks of life and much younger who can kind of challenge the norm. So I'm bringing it back down to that lower level, but I guess sometimes, like anything, it's about keeping it simple.
Thank you. Professor Fernandez, is there, in terms of policy making and the framework of policy making, is there anything that you want to add? Or do you have any couple of slides that we could look at that you could frame some of this discussion?
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, I mean, it's what I could perhaps talk about is how we are perceiving society 5.0, if that would help. So I mean, so I'll see if I can share.
Oh, sorry to put you on the spot, because I know you're incredibly resourceful.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Okay, not a problem. Can you see that? Can you see the screen there?
Not yet.
Can you see it?
This is the good thing about doing things live on the fly.
There you go. It's saying it's sharing. 1 second, let me try.
But while you're doing that, I mean, in the past we've worked together looking at particular frameworks and in terms of policy, and it's very, very important to have a baseline and a context. And you talk about the triple helix, and you talk about how all the different stakeholders are interacting with each other. And I think it's really crosses various aspects and various industry verticals. And very, very important that some of the things are, some of the elements of that policy impact not just particular areas, but actually much, much broader.
Not sure if you can see the screen, but if not, then
I think we will. Let's abandon it. I apologize.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah. Okay. Basically, the example which I perhaps can give is how we are trying to look at an ecosystem. And as I mentioned earlier, an ecosystem is a fairly rich concept. And the reason why it's rich is if you think about a place in isolation, and you then start. So, for example, the northeast, the northwest of UK, or for the matter of fact, UK and other parts of the world. you generally tend to see policy making that typically covers the entire state or the entire region, or in most cases, the entire country. Now, while this works for certain type of policies, what we argue is if you are particularly focused on the concept of Society 5.0, where you are trying to create these so-called super smart societies. So this is where you're trying to bring these stakeholders to create what is a form of a business model, which we call as sustainability equilibrium business model. Now, broadly, what this model argues for, the business models argues for, is on the extreme traditional way of looking at business models. You have on the extreme right, if I use that term, traditional businesses that operate to create profit, and on the exact opposite side, what you have are businesses that are traditionally non-profit, and the entire focus of that is around social value creation. And on the right-hand side is economic value creation. What Society 5.0 needs is a business model that operates in the center. So almost in between a social enterprise on the left and a socially responsible business, which is perhaps the most common type of businesses today. You rarely have any businesses that only operate traditionally for profit, or you have businesses that traditionally operate for non-profit. I mean, it would be fair to say a majority of businesses are socially aware of what they're trying to do with CSR, etc. And on this side, what you have is non-profit organization, but clearly understand that income generation is an important aspect of it. But what Society 5.2 demands is this sustainability equilibrium, a business model that operates in between these two types of paradigm. And to achieve that type of paradigm, what is absolutely essential is you need to understand how that particular place is operating. So the northeast of England, almost what we are arguing here, is different to the northwest of England, which is different to Yorkshire, which is different to Midlands, which is different. So what you need is a vehicle in policy making that can cater to these different regions. Now, every country tries to do it in some form. For example, in the UK, you have economic boards. And what the economic boards try to argue is they're trying to somehow enhance regional policy making. But that's not the same as genuinely making the policy work. Because in a way, what you have attention here is you have businesses that are global, operating in this space, but you're trying to make a regional policy to encourage businesses to engage in a global market. So this is a fairly complex picture. And there are a number of models which, at some point, perhaps I can talk in more detail. But at the heart of this particular policy making is a simple concept called smart digital webbing. Smart meaning the business models that you generate and the policies that support the generation of this business model has to take into account and understand the place. So that is where the smartness comes. The second element of that decision-making strategies, you need to understand that there are companies that operate in a region that are global, and hence digital becomes a central element of it. And the last but not the least element of how you bring the things together is this idea of trying to connect different islands of information across the world, which is where the word webbing appears. So it's smart digital webbing is at the heart of how you come up with regional policies. So that's really what I was trying to perhaps put forth as an example. And this is something we are trialing in the Northeast. This is how you make regions not just competitive, which is absolutely important for businesses, but you bring this sustainability equilibrium business model. So it's not on the other extreme, but more importantly, it's something that caters to Society 5.0.
Thank you. Feel free to jump in, Rona, Monica, or Michael, on how, in particular, this smart digital webbing could be, as an infrastructure based on policy, useful in your in the environment that you're working in.
Well, if I could continue the story and illustrate how the governance frameworks and the stakeholder engagement can actually lead to innovations and applications of technology, the creation of data sources that inform policy making, and the use of tools that were unknown when the processes I'm describing began. I'll return us briefly to Silicon Valley, where some green groups had sued the local governments under the Federal Clean Water Act for impairment of the lower South San Francisco Bay, metal contamination principally, but some other impairments. And under a resolution of that lawsuit, a process was launched, a multi-stakeholder process, to develop action plans to protect that water body. And part of the action that was triggered by this was creation of a community board of scientists and citizens called Emerging Contaminants Work Group. And that group found and documented a phenomenon we hadn't thought of when we started this watershed protection process. And that was microplastic pollutants, microfibers coming into water bodies, into our oceans. Now, fast forward 20 years, we now have a global process called the Ad Hoc Expert Group on microplastics and marine litter and microplastic pollutants. And that group has called for global mapping of plastic pollution. And that global mapping is supported by technologies like Earth observation satellite data that is helping us understand where the loading comes, where the leakage of plastic comes. And through that, we also have discovered the products, the consumer products that we have in our everyday lives that are problematic for protecting our environment and protecting human health. In particular, microfibers, microplastics coming from the apparel that we wear, the synthetic fibers that we use to make approximately 2/3 of the clothing that is sold internationally, globally. And so, again, we're looking now to new technologies from Industrial Revolution 4.0, monitoring through the Internet of Things, using blockchain to certify the materials that go into product streams, using it to facilitate trade so that those producers, those designers know what they're buying when they buy and know what environmental qualities those products, those textiles in particular, have, and then can use that information to remarket new products to show that they are more sustainable, that they are more eco-friendly, that they do not harm other environmental values like water quality or human health from the contamination that is associated with these products. And what I'm describing, in fact, is an integrated approach to sustainable consumption and production, one of the key 17 Sustainable Development Goals that were framed up, again, by a stakeholder process, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which Hilton introduced a few moments ago. That was a process to define a 15-year horizon, a kind of blueprint for the planet, and was adopted by universal consensus. 193 member states of the United Nations adopted that agenda in 2015, following a stakeholder engagement process that accumulated 3 million voices. You know, the greatest experience the globe has ever had of coming together and coming together with one voice to define an agenda through 2030. So I've taken you from the grassroots, from a local governance issue, through science, through technology, and through global governance to get back to where we are today, building toward that successful agenda.
Thank you. Rona, I mean, you've worked with a lot of large global consumer-driven companies who produce incredible levels of product. What initiatives have you been working on or with them in terms of, as Michael said, coming up with new products to really minimize that impact on society?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I just wanted to pick up on something that Kieran had said. And I think what is always going to be a challenge is this shouldn't be a non-for-profit versus making $1 billion. It's actually about bringing it together. Fundamentally, I know infrastructure and supply chain is important, but most businesses will go to supply chain first, and they'll look at where they can save water, where they can increase efficiencies, where they can source their products more sustainably. But I think there's a wider piece around this, around whatever the brand, product or service is, in the communication. So I spent some time last year in Africa, in Ethiopia and also Bangladesh, working with a global apparel manufacturer, looking at all the great initiatives that they were pulling in around sustainable fashion, new materials, fabrics, women's rights. And I think until we get that level of demand, it's still seen that it's the luxury brands that can kind of attain this sense of social awareness. However, you know, interestingly, in this COVID year, we have a UK shortage of cardboard because Amazon has literally just taken up all the entire supply in the UK. So I think a lot of the brands that I work with historically, so, you know, a while back now, may have had a sustainability agenda, but I think what's wakening people up now is that no longer can they just have it to greenwash. They are exposed very rapidly by consumers and clients if they're not doing what they say. And I think it's part of that agenda that it has to sit culturally from the senior leadership teams, chairmen, right through to all the amazing people that make a business happen. Sustainability needs to be injected culturally across the organization. And it's okay if you're not 100% green right now. Every business is in a different stage of its life cycle, but showing the intent of where you are now, being honest, and then showing that growth and platform of where you're going to get to in the next 3 to 5 years, I think is really, really important. And so working with clients at the minute and kind of helping them expose what they are and they aren't doing, I think sometimes is the best thing and often easier to do when you're outside looking in.
Yeah, Monica, I mean, you sit at the center of Europe, the Slovakia, Hungary area, and with lots of traditional industries and lot of developments. How does your engagement with the policymakers and the businesses that you work with in the chamber, what efforts are they making to move forward or accelerate forward in terms of their sustainable development?
Well, the important fact is that our region has been traditionally, as you mentioned, very traditional, focused on heavy industry, which means metallurgy and electrical engineering, for example. And for the past decade, there has been a huge change and transformation of the businesses, and it's gone much more to IT and research and development. So a lot of employment it's now coming from the IT sector and R&D. And as we do have 4 major universities, international universities, and as well 3 research centers. It's a crucial point where we can start, for example, the international cooperation, which is not only in the area of Central Europe, but it's also with, for example, Russian Academy of Science, with China, with Taiwan, etc. So we as a platform, we do the networking and the interconnection between businesses, but also between straight to the governments of different countries. And also the technological parks, and we see it as a huge potential also for the advancement and for example the startups, the cooperation of startups. We had an initiative with Serbia lately, for example. So I think there is a huge potential now with the global interconnection of different stakeholders.
Hilton.
Yes.
Yeah, so if I can add one point
Sure.
to the conversation, if that's okay.
Please do,
I think Michael Michael brought an exceptionally good point, and the point on particularly the SDGs, if I take that as an example, because it also brings attention, and the tension is around when you use data-driven policy making. There are some benefits clearly because you're making policies based on a lot of data, but it also brings in issues. So, for example, on the SDG, the classic example, there's 17 of them, 190 plus countries have signed up to it, and regular data is provided on an annual basis by countries, and there are various league tables that as a result of it emerge, which then, broadly speaking, rank countries and give you benchmarking and so on and so forth. So this is a classic example of how you would collect data to come up with where the gaps are. And the intention of this is, of course, to try to help countries that are perhaps not in the top quarter and put energy on countries that are perhaps at the bottom of the scale. Now, with such a data-driven system of policy making, it also brings unintended consequences. For example, the unintended consequence here is whenever you create a league table, that always gets translated into, as policymakers will like to do, into money, pounds or dollars. And what this picture always shows you is, so if you present this to a policymaker, and the UNESCO report which I have written is exactly on this issue, which perhaps, which can also be, as you know, it's on the citiesabc webpage. And that is, the tension here is when you present such data, the first question a policymaker will ask on this data is, are you asking me for more money? Because there's a huge gap between the top and the bottom. Is that what you present in this data in a nutshell? And the answer is, in some form, that is an outcome from this exercise, but that's not necessarily the intention of what the data is collected for. So the tension we have to be very, very mindful of using data-driven policy making is, while the intentions are to create accurate reflection of what's happening and then use that intelligence to create policy, the unintended consequences of such data-driven mechanisms are so what you then end up doing is, and this is a live debate, at least as far as UNESCO is concerned, you have to constantly justify, this is country by country, and this is happening as much as in the US. In fact, it's happened in the US some time ago with UNESCO in particular, with other countries. And that is, why are we members of an organization? Why are we putting money into this pot, etc., etc. So what Society 5.0 needs as a decision-making strategy, I'm not saying get rid of data-driven. There are merits of data-driven, but I think a lot more focus on smart, citizen-driven policy-making. And I think citizen-driven policy-making is where you try to view what the outcomes are. Now, if you ask me, collectively, does everybody agree with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals? And the answer is yes. So the question now becomes, is why are we creating this boundary, i.e. this data-driven? Because for example, if I pick up SDG 1, no poverty, is as an issue in UK as much as it's an issue in any other country, for example. Okay. Now, the fact that you create this data-driven track on it, all of a sudden creates this hierarchy, because all of a sudden people say, oh, nobody in UK is earning below $1.50, and therefore we are okay. And the answer is, it's not the point. The point of SDG 1 is to ensure that there is no poverty in a place, in a smart society. So the point I'm trying to advocate here is perhaps we need both for different reasons, but I think we need to push for far more smart citizen-driven policymaking. Sorry to jump in there.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And Rona, I know from your body language wants to say something because it resonates with you.
No, absolutely. And I'm a simple human being, and I think that the citizen policy making, and to kind of touch on that a little bit more, Kieran, is around this kind of mass awareness. And actually the word consumer itself means waste. So I think that the thing that's always frustrated me and people that I've dealt with is kind of the action side of it. So it's great having everyone signed up, and it's great having all these policies. What I want to see is, what are the outcomes and what's the action? And I guess that's why I kind of became part of ARC 2030. But there are so many people and so many apps all trying to do the same thing. Whereas we all now know with COVID that when everyone comes together, and to Kieran's point, no one argues with those points in the UN that need to be done, a rich community, a poor community. So I've always envisaged, and maybe I'm just deluded, but this kind of what if scenario where when everyone gets together, like COVID, okay, there's still the blooming competition around who did it first and whatever, but we've done it, we've nailed it. So what if for 12 months globally we worked on those 17 initiatives? That's just a thought to drop out there, but it's about the action, not the policies and the sign-ups. It's who's doing what.
But what you said about before, Rona, was very interesting. Is engagement from the stakeholder, and the stakeholder being young children and the younger generation. It's much more of a bottom-up policy rather than a top-down. Bottom-up meets top-down policy, and digital engagement can do that. I mean, we are able to crowdsource incredible amounts of information on behavior, opinion, action, consumption, and lots of things like that. So we do have the dynamic data. I mean, a lot of data sits in silos, but if we have access to that data, it becomes, and it's put in a framework as Kieran mentioned, so that you don't get this disparity between league tables where the top of league tables are cities like Amsterdam, Boston, New York, London, and Kigali and Nairobi are languishing in the doldrums, where they in turn have great.
Yeah, and for the youth, if you're growing up in that world, you're always forever going to be going, well, that's never going to be me. That's never going to be my village or community or country. So, I was on a call last night with the CEO of Tusk. We know that we need about $600 billion annually. Michael, I think you may have been on that call last night. Annually, and we've probably got about 100 billion. So yes, we need the youth, but we need these big players who have got the dollar. Let's be honest. I mean, I think Jeff Bezos could probably buy Amazon. That's what we need. Give them the tools, and the youth will bring it in.
Let me try to illustrate that with one of the goals, which of course is to address the carbon crisis, the climate emergency. And we have a sustainable development goal that addresses that. In fact, the 17 goals are backed by 169 targets. But if you want to talk about action, if you are an enterprise, if you're a company or a community that is hosting a company, a factory town. I grew up in Cupertino, which turned into Apple's headquarters as I was growing up, and transformed the landscape. So if you live in such a place, you want to understand how those 17 goals translate down to actions that you can take as an entrepreneur, as a citizen, as a consumer. And it turns out to be really tough. It's hard to disaggregate the 169 targets and bring them down to the level where a CEO, a board of directors, an investment group, and managers of enterprises know which actions to take. So coming back to the carbon goal, we have a goal of setting by 2050 the planet on course to be carbon neutral. To do that by 2030, we need to cut 2018 carbon emission levels, greenhouse gas emission equivalency levels, in half. And then between 2030 and 2040, we have to cut them in half again. For that first milestone, we know 60% of the solution is picking the right energy source. Use sustainable energy, you're going to get more than halfway there by 2030. 20% has to do with consumer behavior. And that's where education and consumer choice will be decisive in moving the needle so we can achieve carbon neutrality. The remaining 20%, really that's up to the producers. That's up to designing for the environment. That's up to instituting circular economic business models. And those will be data-driven. We have in the United Nations system, the United Nations Alliance for Sustainable Fashion, the interagency coordinating body, working with UNFCCC, the Climate Change Secretariat. They've developed a playbook for enterprises to help them set science-based targets. So they know what their pathways are to achieving at an enterprise level carbon neutrality. And at a regional level, like the region of Silicon Valley or northwestern or northeastern UK, there are initiatives that can use those benchmarks and promote the education, the training, the knowledge sharing, even among competitors. Because once someone finds a solution to improve performance, we need to ensure those solutions are rapidly shared. And the data platforms will help us. The United Nations Environment Program is about to, it has proposed for its new medium-term strategy, which will be launched in 2022, digital transformation as a new area of foci among our sub-programs of UNEP. And the United Nations General Assembly and the Secretary General has asked UNEP to come up with a global environmental data strategy by 2025. Those are processes that stakeholders can engage in. We already have 30 partnerships with Alibaba, with Google, with other major players in the global economy on how to build the digital tools that will transform our performance on the environment and support the 2030 agenda.
Thank you. Monica, I mean, how much of this resonates with you in terms of your engagement with your members in all the different chambers of commerce in terms of their adoption of digital transformation within the framework, the United Nations Sustainable Goals, and how, as you mentioned, technology is the new industry rather than the old industries. What impact are you seeing from that side?
Yeah, I would like to add to a few points that have been mentioned, and I think the most important word in all of it is balance. It's a balance between different industries, initiatives, points of view, etc. So when Rona was speaking about the youth, I think that's a very important thing, and education is one of the crucial systems and frameworks that need to be sustained from the government, and we need to educate the young generation in a way that they feel and they do require the values that we are talking about, and they consider it as something very natural. So what I see from my work is that the new entrepreneurs and the young generation, they already incorporate the ideas of eco-friendly and sustainable technologies within what they do, and they do not want to continue in the old pathways, and their businesses are going green. So that's very important, and I think we should continue and support it. Support the innovation and also the sustainability via different incentives and also fundings. Other thing which I think is very important in the terms of sustainability and the businesses, it's an environment. It's the EU leadership in this question. And what we have been witnessing, what has happened, it's also the unfairness that the companies, for example, within the EU feel comparing to the third countries, which gives the advantage to the countries outside of the EU, which do not have to comply with the requirements of the European Union, right? So the prices and supply, it's very different. So that is something that I believe we have to face and change, because we are losing all the tradition, not only traditional, but a lot of business and industry within Europe, and outsourcing it outside, which during the COVID-19 we have seen as problematic, right? Because the supply chains have been cut, the global supply chains. So I think that is also a crucial point in our work, which we talk about a lot inside the circle of the Chambers of Commerce and Industry. And a topic which has been faced recently is also the circular economy. So that is something I think we can, within not only Europe but also worldwide, share our experience in and the know-how. And that is something that we have seen in the chamber and within the frameworks that we are active in as very positive, and the contribution has been huge on the national government level, but also on the level of the universities, for example, and exchange programs and common initiatives.
Thank you for that. That segue is very interesting onto our final question, and we've got 10 minutes to get through this. We've talked about policy, we've talked about frameworks, we've talked about initiatives, and we've talked about the technology in order to put those initiatives into place and also to monitor and build the framework. There's a lot of talk about blockchain in terms of creating a truthful environment for the supply chain. We look at AI, which is a great way of enabling and creating less friction within the supply chain. Kieran, in the work that you're doing and dealing with governments and policymakers and even the education system, the tools are they really like the minor discussion where the major discussion is still policy, or is it the other way around?
I think there's a debate on both, Hilton, and so the one of the challenges is technology is emerging at a pace which policy cannot catch up with and will never be able to catch up with. Okay, for example, we talk about AI as a general context, but if I specifically look at augmented artificial intelligence, this is where machines are talking to machines. The question there, which is an unanswered question till date, is what is the ethics that governs when you have machines talking to machines? Okay, there's no framework, there's no policy for it. And broadly, what's happening is machines are talking to machines. It's not like machines are going to stop because of the lack of policy, but machines are talking to other machines. So in a way, I think policy will always lack technology. And it really therefore asks the question, the fundamental point is, what is policy? Do we see policy as purely rules and regulations that have been set by an authority or by a government, which we must obey and follow? Is that what we mean by policy? Okay, and if that is the case, there will never be a point when policy can ever catch up with technology, because the pace of change of technology is at such a level that you just cannot make this happen. So what we need is a social framework, broad guidelines, which we all, we are having this conversation, and we have an unwritten social contract, which is that when one speaker is having a conversation or making a point, the other speakers don't necessarily interrupt or talk while the first speaker is speaking. Now, this is an unwritten rule. It's a social contract which we all collectively buy into to make this particular debate something of value to the listener. So we don't need a policy, we don't need rules, we don't need governance, we don't need somebody to monitor and say these things. So what I'm trying to say is, if we try to curtail technology, and this is one of the issues that creates a marketplace for all sorts of technology to go outside your traditional boundaries to operate, is because of policies that don't match with the pace of how technology is moving. So what is needed, in my view, is you need to have conversations and you need to have framework. Now, the classic example on which I'm particularly involved with is the entire debate around ethics of artificial intelligence, because UNESCO having a role, particularly around culture, having data freedom being one of the remits, this is a live conversation. And the direction of travel here is, we have professional bodies like the IEEE that have a stake in it. We have companies that have a stake in it. We have citizens that have a stake in it. And we have also businesses and regions that have stake in it. So rather than saying the rules of AI are going to be A, B, C, D, what we are trying to think is, can we come up with a framework that is a social construct on how we can behave in this particular system. Now, I'm not saying it's a foolproof system, and you need an element of policing for such frameworks. You can't just have this, and clearly we can see loads of issues. So to answer your question, what is the debate? Is it only about technology, or is it only policy making? What I'm trying to say is you need to have a debate where you look at the place and see what fits in a place. There will be no two places where this concept is going to work. The rules we govern it, for example, in how we operate in UK, cannot be copied and pasted as a mirror policy in other parts of the world. Now, this is where we have gone wrong. Michael gave example of he's from Silicon Valley. Every country has tried to copy and paste the ecosystem of what Silicon Valley they sees as an innovative ecosystem, and have tried to replicate it unsuccessfully. And then the $1 million question, after spending literally $1 million into setting up an ecosystem, why are we not the second Silicon Valley, or why are we not the third Silicon Valley? So I think there is a debate going on how to make this social framework to work, and I think that's the answer in the future.
No, that's very, very clear. I mean, even what Monica was saying, that the challenges that Slovakia is having compared to the challenges that you have in northeastern Europe, UK, to the challenges that Michael's seen from California all the way to Nairobi, and the challenges that your travels with ARC 2030, Rona, have highlighted how different it is to Ethiopia, to the different parts of the world. So it's very, very interesting in terms of there's different stages of technology. Technology can be very frugal and have incredible impact in certain places like Bangladesh or whatever. But that frugal app won't have any impact whether in London, because it's much more sophisticated, even though they might actually be collecting the same sort of information. But it's the app. It's how does the user interact with that? How does the information feed through to the policymakers, and how does do things change going forward?
Yeah, and I think just one thing to put out there, I know we're very short on time now, is just really when you say blockchain to people, it scares them. It's a bit like people don't understand their own pensions. So, on my recent podcast, I interviewed an expert because I didn't understand it. And I don't think I'm a stupid human being, but it was new to me and I didn't get it. So therefore, if we can start integrating this type of education early, but most people are scared by these big words.
I wish we didn't call it blockchain. I wish we would call it Internet of Trust.
Yes.
When you want to sell a good, you don't sell its materiality, you sell the benefits that flow from that. So you sell beauty, you don't sell cloth. In any case, if I could end by mentioning 3 strategic actions that we at UNEP, the Environment Program, propose to take. One is to build digital data ecosystem, which is an inclusive global data architecture and digital ecosystem to support environmental change. The second is digital applications to deploy transformative applications that can harness environmental digital public goods and help inform and transform markets, supply chains, and consumer behavior. And lastly is digital literacy. We need to help citizens understand the digital environment because it is the world that is here now and will transform everything we do, from employment to governance to the environments we live in. So let's help the people understand the language of the future.
One final word quickly, Monica. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, if I just may conclude from my side, I think it's very important that the governments and the businesses take as a priority advancement of technology which serves the people, not the people who serves the technology. And I think because it's possible, and if we take it as a strategic priority, and I also think that we need to create systems and frameworks within which we don't create more gaps within different regions and countries, but also within different or among different parts and groups of the society, not to create more tensions.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much indeed for that. I've really enjoyed this hour. It's been incredibly engaging and very intuitive. I've really learned a lot, and I really want to thank all of you for your participation. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Rona. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Kieran. It's been incredible. I really enjoyed this, and I'm glad that we're going to be recording this. I'm going to have to rewatch it in the comfort of my own home later on. But awesome. Thank you very much indeed, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.